Dawn broke slowly over Savannah in the spring of 1853, the kind of humid southern morning where the air already felt heavy before the sun fully rose. The river breathed fog into the streets, and the city, usually alive with the sounds of carts, gulls, and dockworkers, seemed to pause, as if it knew something extraordinary was about to happen. By the time the bells rang and shop doors creaked open, people were already moving toward Johnson Square and the nearby auction yards. Word had traveled faster than any newspaper could print it. Today would not be an ordinary sale. Today, Savannah would witness something it had never seen before. Men arrived first, dressed in stiff coats despite the heat, their boots polished, their expressions carefully neutral. Planters from the countryside, merchants from the port, lawyers, overseers, and traders gathered in small knots, speaking in hushed tones. Some pretended they were there for business alone, but curiosity pulled them forward as surely as money did. Women followed later, shaded by parasols, escorted by husbands or brothers, their eyes alert with restrained interest. Enslaved people were brought in last, chained, catalogued, and positioned like inventory. They stood in rows, faces trained into practiced stillness, knowing better than to show fear, grief, or hope. The market had seen thousands like them before. Strong backs, broken spirits, familiar suffering, nothing new, nothing surprising, and then he was brought out. The murmur began before anyone fully understood why. Conversations faltered, laughter died mid-breath. Heads turned as if pulled by an invisible force. Even men who prided themselves on discipline and restraint found their eyes lingering longer than intended. He did not look like the others, not in the way Savannah expected a slave to look. His posture was straight, not defiant, but composed. His movements were measured, almost graceful, as if he were stepping onto a stage rather than into chains. Sunlight caught his face, revealing features so striking they unsettled the crowd. High cheekbones, clear skin unmarred by scars, eyes calm yet unreadable. His hair, dark and thick, curled naturally at his temples. There was strength in his build, but it was balanced, athletic rather than brutish, refined rather than raw. For a moment, the auction yard forgot to breathe. In Savannah, beauty was a currency, but it was a dangerous one when it appeared in the wrong body. Enslaved men were expected to be powerful, yes, but never beautiful. Beauty suggested choice, individuality, even desire, things slavery could not tolerate. And yet here he stood, undeniably handsome, radiating a presence that unsettled the carefully constructed order of the market. Some men shifted uncomfortably, clearing their throats. Others narrowed their eyes, offended by a feeling they did not want to name. A few smiled, not kindly, but with the sharp interest of predators who sensed rarity. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Where did he come from? Who had owned him? Why had no one seen him before? A trader nearby muttered that such a man should have been sold quietly, privately, not displayed like this. Another scoffed, suggesting the spectacle was intentional, to drive the price higher, to provoke desire and competition. A planter from South Carolina stared openly, his gaze lingering too long before he caught himself and looked away. Even the auctioneer paused, his practiced rhythm faltering as he took in the reaction. He had sold children torn from mothers, men broken by chains, women reduced to numbers, but this was different. This was dangerous. The enslaved men standing beside him sensed it too. They did not look at him directly, but they felt the tension radiating outward, felt how the crowd leaned in, felt how the air shifted. Some were afraid for him, others were afraid of him. In a world where survival depended on invisibility, standing out could be a death sentence. He remained still, eyes forward, face unreadable. If he felt fear, he hid it well. If he understood the power his appearance held, he gave no sign. That, perhaps, was what unsettled them most. Savannah prided itself on order, on knowing its place in the world. The slave market was a machine designed to reduce human beings into categories: age, strength, obedience, price. This man disrupted that machine. He reminded the crowd, if only for a second, that beauty could exist even in bondage, that dignity could survive chains. And that reminder made people uncomfortable. Some responded with fascination, others with resentment. a few with something close to anger, as if his existence itself were an insult. The auctioneer cleared his throat and began to speak, listing facts in a loud, confident voice meant to reassert control. Age, health, skills, strong, well-trained, no known defects. Each word tried to flatten him back into an object, a commodity, something manageable. But the crowd was no longer listening to the details. Their eyes remained fixed on him, searching his face for clues, for weakness, for proof that he was still just a slave and nothing more. What they found instead was composure, silence, a stillness that refused to beg. As the sun climbed higher, the square grew hotter, the smell of sweat and river water thick in the air. Bidders shifted positions, calculating, reassessing. This was no longer a routine purchase. Owning him would mean something. It would send a message. Some men imagined the envy it would provoke, the quiet admiration, the power of possessing something no one else had. Others worried about what such a man might inspire in women, in other slaves, even in themselves. Beauty could be controlled, but it could also provoke questions, and questions were dangerous. A merchant whispered that the man looked too refined, too composed, as if he had known another life before this one. A lawyer scoffed but did know. Deny it. Someone else murmured a word that should not have been spoken aloud. Bloodline. The idea hung there, unchallenged, unconfirmed, yet impossible to ignore. Savannah was a city built on secrets, on silences carefully maintained. Everyone knew there were things you did not say, histories you did not trace too closely. Looking at him, many suspected this was one of those things. The bell rang again, sharper this time, signaling that the bidding would begin soon. The crowd tightened, the auctioneer raised his hand, the moment stretched, thick with anticipation. In that brief pause, before the first price was called, Savannah stood at the edge of something it could not yet name. This was more than a sale. It was a collision between desire and fear, power and beauty, control and the unsettling reminder of shared humanity. When the first bid finally echoed through the square, it broke the spell, but not entirely. The man remained standing, calm, silent, his gaze steady. He did not know where he would be taken by nightfall. He did not know who would claim ownership over his body, his labor, his future. But he knew this: for one brief morning in 1853, the city of Savannah had looked at him and faltered. And in that faltering, something impossible had already begun. In Savannah, beauty had rules. It belonged to white bodies, white faces, white lineage. It was praised in portraits hung in drawing rooms, in daughters prepared carefully for marriage, in sons groomed to inherit ND and power. Beauty, when properly placed, was celebrated as refinement, as proof of civilization itself. But when beauty appeared where it was not supposed to exist, inside chains beneath a name written in ink beside the word property, it became something else entirely. It became a threat. The man on the auction block embodied that threat the moment eyes lingered on him longer than they should have. His presence disrupted the unspoken agreement that slavery depended on, that the enslaved must appear lesser, visibly, undeniably so. Strength could be tolerated, endurance was expected. But beauty suggested humanity too vividly, individuality too clearly. It invited comparison, and comparison was dangerous. Men who had built their identities on superiority felt something shift inside them, a subtle unease they could not openly acknowledge. Some responded with forced laughter, crude jokes meant to reduce him back to something manageable. Others stared with cold calculation, trying to imagine how such a man could be used, controlled, bent into obedience. A few turned away altogether, offended not by him but by what he stirred in them. In the rigid world of 1853 Savannah, attraction, especially unspoken, especially forbidden, was not merely shameful, it was destabilizing. And here it was, standing in plain sight, impossible to ignore. The danger of his beauty was not limited to white men alone. White women, too, felt its disturbance, though theirs had to remain buried beneath airs of decorum. Behind parasols and carefully averted gazes, curiosity flickered. Society had long warned them of the imagined threat of black men, painting them as monstrous, animalistic, dangerous. Yet the man before them did not fit that lie. He was composed, controlled, striking in a way that defied the stories they had been told. That contradiction unsettled them, and in that unease lived fear, fear of desire, fear of imagination, fear of what acknowledging his beauty might mean. For enslaved people watching from the edges, his appearance carried a different kind of danger. Beauty drew attention. Attention invited scrutiny. Scrutiny often ended in punishment. A slave who stood out risked becoming a target for exploitation, for cruelty, for resentment. They understood that his looks would not protect him, they would expose him. Owners might compete to possess him, but they would also work harder to break him, to prove that beauty did not grant dignity, that grace could still be crushed. Savannah's social order depended on rigid separation. The enslaved were meant to be invisible except when useful. Their bodies were labor, not presence. Their faces were not meant to be admired. The man's very existence challenged that order. He made the lie harder to sustain. Because if a slave could be beautiful, undeniably disturbingly so, then the boundary between master and enslaved blurred in ways no law could fully contain. Men whispered about his potential to cause trouble. They did not mean rebellion. They meant something more intimate, more shameful. A man like that, they feared, could inspire longing, jealousy, obsession. He could unsettle households, disrupt marriages, provoke rivalries. In a society obsessed with control, anything that stirred emotion beyond fear was dangerous. Beauty stirred emotion. It awakened parts of people they preferred to keep buried. Some speculated that his looks would make him valuable as a status symbol. Owning him would be a statement, proof of wealth, power, and exclusivity. Others warned that such ownership came with risk. What if women noticed him? What if other slaves admired him? What if he carried himself with too much confidence, too much quiet pride? Beauty could not be whipped away easily. It lingered. It resisted. And then there was the deeper fear, the one no one spoke aloud. His features suggested ancestry that complicated the simple categories Savannah relied on. His skin tone, his bone structure, the symmetry of his face, these things raised questions about bloodlines, about histories written in bedrooms rather than ledgers. Everyone in that square understood, on some level, that slavery's greatest secret was not brutality, but intimacy. The system was built not only on violence, but on generations of unacknowledged relationships, coerced encounters, and children born into contradiction. To look at him was to glimpse that buried truth, and that was perhaps the greatest danger of all. The Oars of the time tried desperately to keep such realities invisible. One drop of black blood defined a person's fate, regardless of appearance. No matter how refined, how beautiful, how composed a man appeared, the law would insist he was property. But law could not fully control perception. It could not erase the moment of hesitation when someone looked at him and saw not a slave, but a man who challenged their sense of order. Beauty, in this context, became a form of quiet resistance, not chosen, not declared, but inherent. He did not need to speak. He did not need to act. His existence alone forced confrontation, forced men to reconcile their beliefs with what stood before them, forced women to confront feelings they had been taught to deny, forced enslaved people to see both possibility and peril reflected in his face. There was cruelty in that too. To be beautiful in bondage was to be constantly watched, constantly assessed, constantly vulnerable. His body would be desired and disciplined in equal measure, admired in secret, punished in public. Any sign of pride would be met with harsh correction. Any perceived indulgence would provoke jealousy and violence. Beauty would not free him, it would bind him more tightly to the gaze of others. As the auction continued, this truth settled over the crowd like heat. Whatever happened next, whatever price was paid, whatever fate awaited him, Savannah had already learned something uncomfortable. Beauty did not belong exclusively to power. It could appear where power insisted it should not, and when it did, it exposed the fragility of the system that tried to deny it. The man remained silent throughout it all, his expression unchanged. If he understood the danger his appearance carried, He gave no sign. Perhaps he had learned long ago that beauty was not protection, only visibility. Perhaps he had learned that to survive, one must carry dignity quietly, without inviting challenge. Or perhaps, in that stillness, there was something else entirely. A private knowledge that no one in Savannah could see, a secret that made their fear almost understandable. In that square, beneath the southern sun, beauty became more than an attribute. It became a fault line, and Savannah, for all its confidence and cruelty, felt the ground shift beneath its feet. By the time the auctioneer called for a pause, the rumors had already taken on lives of their own. They moved faster than the bids, faster than the scratching of ledgers and the clink of coins. In Savannah, secrets rarely stayed buried for long. They seeped through floorboards, travelled along verandas, lingered in the corners of parlours and taverns. And this man, silent, composed, impossibly striking, became the centre of a story no one could fully see, but everyone felt pressing against the edges of truth. It began with speculation, the kind spoken softly, as if volume itself could summon consequences. Someone claimed he'd come from a plantation far inland, sold quietly after an owner's sudden death. Another insisted he had been kept hidden for years, never allowed into public view until now. A trader swore he had never seen a slave like him pass through Charleston or New Orleans, which meant one of two things: he was new to the market, or someone had gone to great lengths to keep him off it. Each version contradicted the last, but all agreed on one thing: there was something wrong with his paperwork. Men leaned in closer when they spoke of it, lowering their voices instinctively. They talked about missing names, about dates that did not align, about records that felt deliberately vague. Age listed approximately, origin uncertain, parentage unrecorded. These were not uncommon flaws in the slave trade, but combined with his appearance, they felt deliberate, as if someone somewhere had erased details on purpose, as if clarity itself was dangerous. The most daring whispers circled around his face. It was too refined, too symmetrical, too reminiscent of features found in portraits rather than fields. One man muttered that he had seen the same eyes before, on a white child years earlier, in a different county. Another laughed nervously and dismissed it as coincidence, but the idea lingered. Savannah was full of families whose histories were more complicated than their public stories suggested. Everyone knew it. No one acknowledged it. The truth, whatever it was, hovered in the space between what could be proven and what could never be admitted. Slavery depended on silence as much as chains. It relied on everyone agreeing not to ask certain questions, not to trace certain lines too carefully. And this man made those questions impossible to ignore. His very existence threatened to expose the fragile scaffolding of lies that held the system together. Some whispered that he was the son of a master and an enslaved woman, raised quietly, protected until circumstances made protection inconvenient. Others went further, suggesting he might have been educated, taught to read or write, then stripped of those privileges once his presence became risky. There were even murmurs, spoken only when glances confirmed no one else was listening, that he might not have been born enslaved at all, that something had gone wrong, that ownership itself might be a fiction written after the fact. These rumors carried danger not just for him, but for everyone who repeated them. To question a man's status was to question the law, the market, the entire social order. And yet, people could not help themselves. Curiosity mixed with fear, and fear sharpened imagination. In Savannah, scandal was a quiet currency, traded discreetly, never acknowledged openly. This man was rich with it. The auction yard became a theatre of restraint. Faces remained composed, but eyes flicked constantly, searching for reactions, for signs of recognition. Did anyone here know him? Had anyone seen him before? Some thought they saw hesitation cross the face of a prominent planter, a flicker of something like recognition quickly masked. Others claimed a merchant left abruptly, pale and shaken, unwilling to bid at all. Whether these observations were true or imagined did not matter. The story fed itself. The enslaved people nearby sensed the tension, though they did not know its source. They understood secrecy. They lived within it. They had watched children disappear from plantations without explanation, watched masters grow distant or cruel when reminded of their own contradictions. They knew that the most dangerous truths were the ones spoken only in glances, and they watched this man closely, wondering what burden he carried so silently. He did not react to the whispers, or if he did, he hid it well. His gaze remained steady, his posture unchanged. Perhaps he had lived with these rumors all his life, hearing fragments without ever being told the whole. Perhaps he knew exactly who he was and understood the cost of that knowledge. Or perhaps ignorance was his only protection. The crowd could only guess, and guessing only deepened their unease. Savannah was a city skilled at denial. It built beauty over brutality, elegance over exploitation. The river carried goods and bodies alike, but only the goods were recorded. The man before them threatened to disrupt that balance. If his origins were questioned too openly, others might follow. Stories might unravel. Respectable families might find themselves reflected in a face they could know. He acknowledged that was why the rumors never fully surfaced. They floated, half-formed, never solid enough to challenge officially, but strong enough to shape behavior. Bidders hesitated or grew more aggressive based not on fact, but on fear. Fear of owning a man whose existence invited scrutiny, fear of not owning him and allowing someone else to control the secret he represented. There was also another layer to the whispers, darker and more unsettling. Some spoke of desire, of private encounters that left behind consequences no one wanted to claim. They spoke of houses where enslaved women were kept close not for labor, but for silence. They spoke of children born with features that demanded explanation, explanations that never came. This man, they feared, was proof that such histories could not remain buried forever. And yet nothing could be said aloud. The auctioneer did not ask questions, the law did not inquire. The ledger accepted vague entries without protest. Slavery thrived on such ambiguity. It allowed uncomfortable truths to be absorbed, neutralized, turned into property rather than scandal. As long as no one named the secret, it could not threaten the system. Still, the unease lingered. The crowd sensed that something fragile had been exposed, if only briefly, that a boundary had been tested, that the past, usually kept at a safe distance, had stepped forward in human form and demanded to be seen. As the bidding resumed, the rumors did not fade. They settled deeper, shaping every glance, every calculation. Men bid not only for a body, but for control over a story, over a mystery that could either elevate them or destroy them, depending on how carefully it was handled. The man stood at the center of it all, silent and still, carrying a history no one could confirm and no one dared confront. Whatever the truth was, whatever impossible secret lay beneath his composed exterior, it had already done its work. It had unsettled Savannah. It had reminded them that beneath every ledger entry lay a life, and beneath every life lay a story that could not always be erased. And in that knowledge, quiet and dangerous, the city held its breath. When the auctioneer finally raised his gavel again, the square felt different. The heat had intensified, but it was not the sun alone that made the air heavy. It was anticipation, thick, charged, almost electric. What had begun as a routine sale had transformed into a contest of will, pride, and unspoken fear. Every man who remained in the crowd understood that this was no longer about labor. It was about possession, about power, about who would walk away holding not just a body but a secret. The opening bid was higher than expected. A murmur rolled through the crowd as a planter near the front lifted his hand without hesitation. He was known, respected, wealthy enough to make a statement without explaining himself. The price climbed immediately, another bidder answering just as quickly, then another. The rhythm of the auctioneer's voice sharpened, feeding off the energy, driving it higher. Coins, numbers, and ambition collided in rapid succession. Some men bid with cool calculation, eyes narrowed, faces unreadable. Others betrayed their emotions openly, tight jaws, flushed cheeks, fingers twitching as if the act of bidding itself steadied something restless inside them. This was not a purchase anyone wanted to lose quietly. To step back now would invite questions, speculation, weakness. Each raised bid was a declaration, I am not afraid, I can control this. But control was exactly what seemed so uncertain. As the numbers rose, the crowd began to realize something extraordinary was happening. This man was fetching a price far beyond what his age or listed skills justified. Whispers spread again, this time less restrained. People spoke of records being broken, of figures that would be remembered long after this day. Savannah had seen expensive slaves before, prized craftsmen, strong field hands, skilled house servants. But this was different. The value placed on him felt symbolic, almost desperate. One bidder dropped out abruptly, shaking his head as if waking from a trance. Another followed, muttering under his breath about trouble and temptation. Yet for every man who withdrew, another stepped forward, compelled by something he could not quite name. The bidding narrowed, tension tightening like a drawn wire. The man himself remained still, though his fate was being decided in numbers shouted across the yard. He listened without reacting, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the crowd. Perhaps he had learned long ago not to hope, not to dread too visibly. Or perhaps he understood that hope and dread were luxuries denied to someone in his position. Either way, his composure only intensified the spectacle. A man who begged could be dismissed. A man who endured silently demanded attention. As the price climbed higher still, motivations shifted. For some, it became about winning, about denying rivals the satisfaction of ownership. For others, darker calculations emerged. Whoever bought him would decide where he lived, who he saw, what he remembered. They would control the narrative around him, suppress rumors, manage appearances. Ownership meant silence, his silence, and perhaps the silence of others. The auctioneer sensed the stakes and pressed harder, his voice rising, almost triumphant. He praised the man's health, his strength, his obedience. He avoided anything that might provoke further speculation. The script was familiar, rehearsed, designed to reduce a human life to reassuring terms. But the crowd no longer needed convincing. They were invested beyond reason. Two men now dominated the bidding. One was a plantation owner with vast holdings, a man accustomed to being obeyed. The other was a merchant whose wealth came from the river, from trade and transport, from knowing how to move goods quietly. Their rivalry was palpable. Each bid landed Lee. Key a challenge, daring the other to retreat. Neither did. Observers began to sense that this contest had less to do with the man's usefulness and more to do with what he represented. Owning him would be an assertion of authority over something unsettling. It would be a way to claim mastery, not just over a body, but over doubt itself. To say, whatever questions you think you see here, I have the power to make them disappear. The price climbed again, and then again. Gasps broke through the crowd's restraint. This was no longer just expensive, it was shocking. People would talk about this sale for years, even if they pretended not to understand why it mattered. The ledger would record the number, but not the reasons behind it. At last, one of the two faltered. His hesitation was brief but fatal. The other seized the moment, calling out a final bid with confidence that bordered on relief. Silence followed, heavy and expectant. The auctioneer looked around, his gavel raised, waiting for a challenge that did not come. When it fell, the sound cracked through the square like a gunshot. Sold. A strange mixture of reactions rippled outward. Some exhaled as if released from a collective tension. Others looked disappointed, even resentful. A few appeared relieved they would not have to confront whatever owning him might entail. The winning bidder straightened, satisfaction flickering across his face. Not joy, but something closer to triumph. The man was led away, chains adjusted, transaction complete. Just like that, a life had changed hands. Yet the weight of the moment lingered. People spoke in low voices as they dispersed, replaying the bids, the figures, the expressions they had seen. They would not speak openly of why the price had risen so high. They would say it was his health, his strength, the market. But beneath those explanations lay something else, unspoken and unresolved. For the buyer, ownership began immediately. He would decide how visible this man would be, where he would work, how closely he would be watched. He would decide whether the rumors were allowed to fade or forced into deeper silence. Possession brought responsibility, but also power. The power to shape reality through control. For Savannah, the auction left a mark. It exposed how fragile certainty could be, how quickly order could tremble when confronted with something it could not easily categorize. The price paid was not just for labor, but for reassurance that the system still held, that beauty could be owned, that mystery could be contained. As the square emptied and the day moved on, the sale was already becoming legend. People would remember the number, they would remember the tension, they would remember the man whose presence had turned an ordinary auction into something unforgettable. And though they might never agree on why it happened, they would all sense that something important had been bought and buried at the same time. The man disappeared into his new owner's world, carrying his silence with him. But the truth Savannah tried to purchase that day did not vanish so easily. It lingered in memory, in whispers, in the uneasy knowledge that some things, no matter how high the price, cannot be fully owned. The city tried to move on. Savannah always did. By evening, the auction square was empty again, its dirt trampled smooth, its echoes swallowed by routine. Ships docked, ledgers closed, lamps were lit in drawing rooms where conversations returned to safer subjects. Officially, the day had ended like any other transaction. One man sold, one man bought, one number written neatly into a book that would outlive everyone involved. But beneath that orderly surface, something refused to settle. The truth had been buried the moment the gavel fell. Not destroyed, buried. There was a difference, and Savannah knew it well. The man vanished into his new owner's world with no ceremony, no farewell, no explanation. He was moved quickly, deliberately, away from the city's center, away from curious eyes. Those who noticed said it felt rushed, almost anxious, as if delay itself posed a risk. Within days, his presence became rumor rather than fact. People spoke of him in the past tense, as though distance could dull the memory of his face. But memory has a way of resisting orders. The impossible truth, the one never written down, was not a single revelation, but a convergence of quiet certainties. It lived in the glances exchanged during the auction, in the bids that climbed too high too fast, in the records that said too little. It lived in the knowledge that slavery had never been clean, never simple, never purely divided along the lines it claimed to enforce. The system insisted on absolutes, but life had always been messier. Some believed the truth was blood, that somewhere in his ancestry lay a name that could not be spoken, a lineage that crossed boundaries the law pretended did not exist. In Savannah, such crossings were common enough to be understood, but rare enough to remain officially invisible. Generations of children had been born into that silence, too white to fit the lie, too black to escape it. Their existence was absorbed into the system, their stories flattened into property. Others believed the truth was choice, that at some point someone had decided it was safer, easier, more profitable to let him disappear into bondage rather than risk scandal. Freedom, after all, required witnesses, paperwork, acknowledgement. Slavery required only silence, and silence was abundant. What made the truth impossible was not that it could not be known, it was that it could not be acknowledged without unraveling everything around it. To admit what he represented would mean admitting how fragile the categories of the world really were, how much depended on denial, how many respectable lives were built on erased histories. The man himself carried that truth quietly. Whatever he knew or did not know, he understood the cost of visibility. His survival depended on restraint, on not asking the wrong questions, on not forcing recognition. Dignity became something internal, carefully guarded, expressed only in moments when no one was watching. Those moments were rare. His new life, whatever shape it took, was defined by watchfulness. Beauty, once again, proved to be no shield. If anything, it invited tighter control. He would be monitored more closely, corrected more harshly, praised more cautiously. Anything that drew attention could be construed as defiance. The very qualities that had stunned Savannah now became liabilities to be managed. And yet, the truth persisted, not in open rebellion, but in subtle ways. in the way people hesitated when speaking of him, in the way certain names were avoided in conversation, in the way his sale became a reference point, a story retold with careful omissions. "Do you remember that auction?" someone would say, and the other would nod, understanding exactly which auction was meant. History tried to erase him the way it erased so many others, by reducing him to a line item, by stripping away context, by allowing time to blur specifics. Records would survive, but they would say nothing of why the price was so high, why the crowd reacted as it did, why the whispers lingered long after the square emptied. Future readers would see numbers, not tension, ink, not fear, but erasure is never complete. What remained was a kind of ghost, an awareness that something significant had passed through that space and been deliberately obscured. The impossible truth did not need to be articulated to exert influence. It lived in the discomfort of those who remembered, in the caution of those who understood too much, in the silence of those who had learned, through generations, that survival often meant letting the truth go unnamed. Savannah would continue to tell itself its preferred story, of order, of hierarchy, of clear lines between power and powerlessness. But beneath that story, cracks had formed. The man's existence had exposed them, briefly, undeniably. He had forced the city to confront the reality that humanity could not be neatly categorized, that beauty could emerge where it was forbidden, that identity could not always be controlled by law. The truth was impossible not because it lacked evidence, but because acknowledging it would require courage the system did not possess. It would require admitting that slavery was not just cruel but hypocritical, not just violent but intimate, that it relied on lies told so often they felt like facts. In the end, Savannah chose comfort over honesty, silence over reckoning. The man's story was allowed to fade into myth, into speculation, into fragments passed down without names. And yet, in that fading, something endured, a reminder that even the most powerful systems cannot fully erase what they fear. The gorgeous man sold in 1853 became more than a memory. He became a symbol of what history tried and failed to bury, a quiet challenge to the narratives written by those in power, a testament to the truth that dignity can survive even when stripped of everything else. And somewhere beyond the reach of ledgers and laws, that truth waited, not for recognition, but for the moment when silence would no longer be enough,